Chapter 11. A Hero Among Us. Sade found Raven in his study looking out over the sea. His mentor's hair had grown streaks of silver in the last few years, but his body was still strong and lithe. Raven's feet rested on a small stool as he sat beside his desk, and the familiar pose reminded Sade of the many hours he spent in his tutelage. If Raven were ever to reject him or betray him as Gerald did, it would be infinitely worse. Perhaps I grow too trusting even of this mentor. Raven, who always knew Sade better than Sade did, said in a low tone, "The betrayals are over, young man. You have found your home among us." Sade was taken aback, but instead of revealing it, he decided to counter insight with inquiry. "If the Sevwar are my family, Slithestone my home, then I am ready to be initiated into our highest secrets." Raven closed the book that had been open on his lap and set it on the table between them. Next to it was an unrolled scroll decorated with a woodcut press of a large deer, an elk, with a fell look on his face, antlers like swords, and teeth like a jackal. He sensed Sade staring at it. "Secrets like this?" Raven asked. "Indeed. What is it?" "A Stygorn elk. Look closely. Any Sevwar who found one would be a hero among us." "Why is that?" Raven rolled up the scroll. "In time, all will be explained. But first, a last mission. Your last as an apprentice to me." Despite himself, Sade felt the blood run to his face. His head felt light while his extremities were suddenly heavy. "Sir, I have not pleased you. Was my punishment of Gerald unsanctioned?" "No. It was masterful. Your crew came back enthralled of you. A fitting fate was meted out to him. I say last mission, because you are close to being a full sorcerer now. Soon you will don the red cloak all sorcerers wear for their first 5 years. You have excelled in magecraft, business, and leading men. Now, finally, a test of your guile." "I am honored, sir." Raven scrutinized him carefully before beginning. "Foyle Island, home to King Robert and Queen Yvonne. They are enemies of ours, allied to old powers that oppose those whom we serve. We want nothing less than the complete eradication of their line, ruin to come to their people, destitution to their house." "So, we are at war." "So to speak, but not that they know it. That is why we will send you." "With a contingent of warriors," Sade said with eagerness, picturing a pitched battle, a raid, or a siege to bring the lords of the Isle to their knees. He would have an army at his command, he imagined with a rush. But again, as if Raven had special insight into his mind, his mentor broke into his thoughts. "It is the slow knife that cuts deepest. An all-out war would unite their people and tax our resources. We are a small order, not a nation-state. What is needed is dissolution from within. You will go with a single companion of my choosing. You will move to Foyle, live among the people, earn their trust, and find a way to ferment dissent, distrust, and discord. Means of force will not be available to you. It is a disease of hearts you must be, not an attack of steel." Sade swallowed. For months, he had been a captain of men, a leader in the open. Now he was to bring down a kingdom with subterfuge. "Consider it the last of 2 tests." "2 tests? Which is my penultimate one?" "This. There can be no bond over that of the order." "I have none." "Do you? What of your brother?" Sade caught himself. So close was he to Vandellas, so intimate their bond that he took it for granted. He was united with his brother the way that his spirit was united with his body. Only death would separate them. "He also serves the Sevwar. In honoring him, I honor the order." "No," Raven said, cutting him short, his voice iron. "You honor the order by honoring the order, no one else." Sade was quiet, unsure as to what to say next. If this were a test, he was worried he was failing. "You will not be given any army, nor even a cadre of men. You will receive a single companion, as I said, of my choosing, the one best suited for you in this mission. You will travel to Foyle, disguised as a lowly weather worker and healer, with this companion posing as your servant. You will travel on trade vessels and passenger ships, and You must renounce your brother for the order. Sade felt as if the room would come apart around him, as if an ocean wind had swept into the library and threatened to blow them all out, furniture, books, bodies into the sea. His brother was his life, his only bond to what was his identity, his only family left. But the Sevwars are family now. Sade was not one to trust, even Raven. Betrayal was the way of the world. Perhaps that was what Raven wanted to teach him, that to earn more power, he would even have to turn his back on his brother. For what felt like an eternity, Sade sat in silence, deliberating, weighing his loyalty, his love for Vandalis. He saw his brother as he had looked that first day they had lost their mother, his eyes red and swollen, his cries inconsolable. He remembered sleeping, curled next to him in their uncle's cabin, inside the stolen skiff, even under the docks at Mornaport. There was the thrill he felt when Vandalis won his first match in the ring, the pain he had felt when the slavers on the Judgment had beaten his brother. It had been as if the blows had landed on Sade himself. And there was the relief he felt that day, opening his eyes to see all the crew of the Judgment dead. But his brother somehow spared. There was no magic more powerful than love. Or was there? For the sake of power, he had to find out. For the sake of power, and there was nothing but power, he knew he would have to forsake even love. In the end, there can only be power. I renounce him, Sade said, his stomach fluttering, his head light. Louder. I renounce him. Raven sat up and stared at him over his folded hands. So be it. Your bond to the Sevwar is greater than that of blood. You will go to Foyle with the only family you have left, the Sevwar. He pushed aside the stack of books and inclined his head toward his student, his fingers rolling the broken ring that hung around his neck. Now, it is time for you to learn who our true masters are. Now it is time for you to learn of the Kryen. It was raining when the tide was changing that afternoon, when it was time for Sade to depart on a vessel trading ironworks for furs in the north. Sade covered himself in a sealskin cloak and made his way down to the dock with a satchel of modest belongings that fit his status as a lowly weather worker. He was dressed as a traveler, not a Sevwar, and although Raven had shared with him some of the secrets of their order, the story of their true masters, and the promise of their powers, he felt a physical pain in his chest, a pain of loneliness, of exile. For what was the promise of eternal life, limitless power, if he were alone? He had traded the one bond he had in the world for knowledge of masters he might never meet. Before he was halfway down the dock, he had to lean against a pylon to steady himself. He wrung his hands and was taken by surprise by a sudden surge of sickness in his throat. He vomited over the side of the dock, the contents of his stomach spreading out in a cloud, fouling the water. Raven had said he would be joined by a companion, and, indeed, as he walked down the dock, he saw a figure, also hooded and standing in the rain, features indistinct in the rain and mist, waiting as the trading galley rolled towards them. Sade cleared his throat, wiped his mouth, and adjusted the satchel on his shoulder. He threw his shoulders back and his chin up to project a sense of confidence he did not feel at the moment. Would the companion be of a higher rank, or lower? Would they be equals, traveling in disguise? Perhaps rank would not matter. He rounded on the figure and looked into his face. Vandalis. His brother's features were strained, his face wet, not just rain, but tears. He knows I renounced him, Sade thought. Raven told him. There were no words of apology that would do. He did not expect his brother to understand. There was no explaining his decision. You have come to say goodbye, Sade finally said, his jaw shaking. Vandalis looked back at him with an expression of bewilderment. No, Raven said I must go to Foyle. Foyle? Yes, without you. Sade could not help but smile. His knees felt weak. He said I must go without you, that he would send me a companion best suited for me. Could he mean me? He must. They embraced. Sade fell to thinking of Raven and what gift he had given him and his own brother. The order was paramount, but in the end the best suited companion was his brother. He wondered if his mentor watched even now from the window of his study high above. Despite the relief they both felt, Vandela still cleared his throat, as if choking on something that he could not swallow. "What is wrong, brother?" "Raven told me I had to choose. Choose between you and the Order." A stillness came over Sade like a pall. He released his brother from his embrace. "He told me the same." Vandalis fought to keep his lower lip from trembling, but lost the battle. He looked away. "I'm sorry, Sade. I renounced you." Silence came over them as they each searched the other's face for some outward sign of change. What did betrayal look like after all? Could words truly surmount blood? As the ship neared, neither said another word. Chapter 12. Betrayal. The Elawn glided over the hills of the island. After so many weeks over water, Gabriella was fascinated by the undulations of this new land, its hills, valleys, and ridges rising higher than waves. Towards the center of the island, a few rocky promontories jutted out of the forest. Gabriella steered the Elawn around their rocky shoulders to remain close to the treetops, where gray, blue, white, and blackbirds sang among the autumn leaves. There were numerous lakes in the autumnal forest, mirrors glittering among spilled paint. Dameon acted as if he had forgotten the wyvern altogether. The foreign bird species were the objects of his fascination now. He spoke breathlessly, mostly to himself, comparing the birds he saw with birds he knew while obsessively pointing out their differences. When the rest of the island rolled into view, Gabriella could see wisps of chimney smoke twisting over a town in the distance. Fishing boats bounced in the waves of the channel between the island and the mainland. Throughout the forest below, breaks in the trees revealed houses nestled next to cultivated fields. Since leaving Harkness, the little crew of the Elawn had not benefited from a single meeting with land dwellers. Gabriella hoped the inhabitants of this island would be different. At this lower altitude, as the Elawn traversed this strange land, Gabriella noticed that the mud and timber houses of this island were of an unusual design. Round, with a central circular main room, with smaller round rooms off to the side. The largest one Gabriella saw was 2 stories. Despite the difference in style, she was struck by the homesickness when she saw signs of normal life. The grass and vegetation about the main houses trampled into bare earth by foot traffic, fire pits needing tending, shelters for animals. She spied pigs, chickens, and goats, as well as crops such as maize, beans, and wheat. Life on this island was not terribly different than life on Harkness. As the Elawn floated over the houses, children were the first to spot the airship. The smallest ran, the older ones waved. Gabriella waved back. The children cheered and danced in the yards outside their homes. A better welcoming than Kajil or Foyle already, she thought. It was the same scene on every ridge. Children gathered on one hill after another, alerted by the cries across the valley that something was coming. Gabriella rushed about the deck, waving back at the children, and even shook Dameon's arm to make him wave. She wanted to appear as friendly as possible. She lowered the ship so that the Elawn could be seen more clearly. A blast sounded in the sky, a deep, somber note. It sounded again. This time, Gabriella could tell it came from behind them. On the last ridge, they had passed over a man who stood among the children, with a large shell in his hand. Gabriella waved at him, but he ignored her and began to blow on the horn. The sound had a sobering effect on the island children. They now stood in silence and watched. The sound also drew parents out of their houses or out of the fields. When they looked up to the sky and spotted the Elawn, they became frantic. Their arms jerked wildly as they called their children into their homes and slammed the doors shut. Odd, Gabriella thought, a sinking feeling in her chest. Stretching along the length of the channel, the main settlement on the eastern shore was much too large to be called just a village. Gabriella brought the ship lower. The forest ended, and the Elawn floated over fields, their approach now heralded by rolling blasts from conch horns all over the island. Workers dropped their tools and bundles and ran for cover. Women cowered. Men hollered to one another. Gabriella saw people on the edges of the fields disappearing into the forest. Some fields looked completely empty until, looking straight down between stalks of wheat, she saw people cowering, mothers spreading themselves over their children. What's going on? They sense we're powerful, Mortimer said. It might be a good hand to play. The glint in his eye that was there when he had held his sword over the wyvern egg was returning. Adamantus regarded him with narrow eyes. Nonsense. We can't be very powerful if our ship is about to collapse and our stores are running low, Gabriella said. Yet islanders continued to flee before the Elawn. The ship was low among the treetops now, and Gabriella slowed their approach as they neared the town. Alerted by the horn blasts from the hills and the cries from the fields, the town square was feverish with activity. The street vendors were shaking down their tents and throwing their wares into sacks. Beyond the town, in the channel, fishermen opened their sails and fought the waves to return to port. A bell rang. A girl grabbed her little brother and hustled him away. Gabriella remembered that day when the Sev War had come to Harkness. Now, strangely, the roles were reversed. She was part of the visiting party, bringing what was new and perhaps dangerous. The ship groaned and crunched as it settled on the earth. As she landed, Gabriella realized they were taking a risk. After all, they were highly outnumbered, but her intuition told her the people were too scared to attack them. The townspeople stood frozen, all of them more than a stone's throw away, as if an invisible fence around the Elawn held them all back. It seemed to Gabriella as if the entire world had stopped. Only the wind stirred, flapping a few streamers on the peaks of buildings and shaking the slack shrouds on the ship. Finally, an old man shuffled out from the crowd. He was stooped and walked with small steps, but Gabriella could tell that he had once been a tall, imposing man. The skin on his face was leathery and lined from years of hard work. His white hair and beard were long and braided. Braiding was something only women did in Harkness. "Why is his beard braided? Braids are for girls," Dameon asked. Gabriella's mouth was dry. She struggled to swallow and gave the answer her father always did when she asked about visiting sailors who had foreign ways of tying knots. "Different twists for different tribes, Dameon." The man stopped a few steps away from the edge of the crowd. He spoke in a strong voice that belied his frail appearance in a language that was incomprehensible to Gabriella. She felt intimidated until she noticed that one of the braids in the man's beard was tied in a bright pink ribbon. Something changed in her towards him. He was still as imposing as before, but she sensed a softness to him. Gabriella envisioned a granddaughter or even a great-granddaughter sitting on his lap, tying the bow. She knew they could trust this man. "He has welcomed us," the elk said. "You can understand them?" Mortimer asked. "I understood what I heard," the elk said. "My kind possesses the gift of tongues. Whether that includes all languages of the windblown worlds, I am not sure. If it includes the language of these people, we will soon find out." "Let's go down there and find out standing on their level," Gabriella suggested. The elk nodded his approval. Gabriella lowered the gangway and took Dameon by the hand, which she noticed he squeezed firmly, and led him down. Adamantus followed. Mortimer came last. Then, something unexpected happened. The old man got down onto his knees, shaking as he did so. He leaned forward, placed his forearms on the ground to steady himself, and did not stop until his head touched the earth. There was a shuffling sound all around them as the hundreds gathered did the same. "This is certainly a better reception than I was expecting," Mortimer remarked. They remained prostrated a long time. Not a word was spoken. It occurred to Gabriella that perhaps the people were waiting for one of them to tell them to rise, as kings and queens would do in stories. She rushed forward. "No, no, no," she said, coming up beside the old man. He clearly could not understand her words, but fear filled his eyes as he sensed her displeasure. She took his hand. A few villagers nearby lifted their faces tentatively to watch what was unfolding. "Please," Gabriella said. "Please get up. We are visitors, not conquerors." Still, uncomprehending of her words, the old man obeyed her actions and moved to stand up. It was not something he could do without her help. She held his hand and steadied his arm the same way she had helped her grandmarm before she passed. When she looked around the square, she saw that every other villager was still prostrate. Gabriella ran to each person along the edge of the crowd and bid them to get up, helping any old woman and men to their feet. Most of the people recoiled at her touch, but the old seemed grateful. As she made a circuit of the square, the naked stares of fear turned into smiles of relief and welcome. Children peeked between their mothers' skirts. Gabriella noticed how their hair braids were completely different to those she remembered on Harkness, and the jewelry of shades and shapes she had never seen before. Some men had artwork painted upon the backs of their hands and sides of their necks. By the time she had circled the entire crowd, children were reaching out to touch her. She came back to the old man. He nodded and spoke again the same words of welcome. Adamantus came close beside him, listening. Mortimer remained at a distance, his hand on his sword. The presence of the elk, so close, so tame, made the old man quiet again. Gabriella touched the elk on the nose to show that he was friendly and motioned for the man to do so as well. "Soft," she said, touching the elk. The man muttered a word in response. "Elk," Adamantus translated. He said elk. The man backed away in shock as the elk spoke. The entire crowd erupted in whispers, then quickly went silent again. Gabriella tried to show with her hands that Adamantus was friendly. Then she pointed to herself and said her name. She did the same with Dameon, Adamantus, and Mortimer. "Chaws," the man said, pointing to himself. He began to speak slowly, and after a few words, Adamantus caught the meanings and began to translate. "He says that it has been many years, generations even, since they have seen an airship. He knows from stories that his grandparents told that those who sailed the airships, he calls them the Ranchma, are dangerous, murderous sorcerers. The people of this island still fear the Ranchma, but Cha sees that we are not they, and so he welcomes us to this island. Vizon. He and his people are the Vizani." "Tell him we are definitely not sorcerers and mean no harm," Gabriella said. "Tell him no such thing," Mortimer interjected, speaking for the first time. "They outnumber us. Who is to say once they realize we are not wizards, they will not rush us, kill us, and steal the Elawn? If you had not run about holding hands with all of them, they still might fear us. Fear is the only advantage we have." "Mortimer," Adamantus said, "there is power in friendship, too." Mortimer's nostrils flared. Adamantus spoke in the language of the Vizani now, for a long while, with only a few interruptions from Chas when the old man asked questions. Gabriella sensed that the elk was telling their entire story. When Adamantus had finished, the old man nodded his head and said, "Kawa." The elk translated, "It means all is well." Chas turned and spoke to the crowd. He seemed to tell a short version of their story. Then his tone changed to one of exhortation. The people clapped, and in an instant, the entire square turned into a tumult of activity. "What is going on?" Mortimer asked. "He has told the villagers our story," Adamantus said. "They have chosen to help us." There was a rebuke in the elk's voice, but it was subtle. Already, Vizani women were carrying bushels of flour to the Elawn. Mortimer ran to stop them from climbing the gangway. "Do you really trust them to go aboard?" he asked Gabriella and Adamantus. "I do," she answered. "As do I," the elk said. Mortimer shook his head, exasperated. "I must object." He turned to the women and said, "Only children may come aboard." The women looked at Chas, then Adamantus, who translated for them. The women quickly called their children out of the crowd. The mothers seemed happy to drop their loads at the bottom of the gangway and let their children carry them up into the ship. More children materialized and began rushing up the gangway, cheering. Chas's eyes twinkled, and he said something in Gabriella's ear. Adamantus translated. "Your friend will wish he had held his tongue." The old man was right. Already Mortimer was hurrying about the deck as children swung on ropes and bounced on railings. Chas called to other children and gestured for them to go help the visitor on the ship. Gabriella giggled in spite of her best efforts not to. Gabriella had been born too late to know either of her grandfathers, but she felt her heart warm towards Chas and wished she had known a grandfather like him. Chas led Adamantus, Dameon, and Gabriella to an awning attached to one of the buildings at the edge of the square. Chairs and tables waited in the shade. This may have been a foreign land, but Gabriella recognized a place for drinking and talking when she saw it. Other elders in the village gathered and sat down with them, while one hung a kettle over a fire to boil water. As they settled down under the awning, chairs were offered to her and her brother. Dameon remembered to thank them, although his voice was slightly too loud. Dameon kept close to her, his head nodding quickly, his eyes darting about them randomly as mayflies. He was nervous. The Vizani did not fear him, but they did not approach him. They mostly ignored him, and Gabriella was grateful. Some of the children stared, but none taunted or laughed. Adamantus began to speak in Vizani. Gabriella could understand from certain words like "this" and "Nicomedes" that he was inquiring about the proximity of the city. She was pleased to see Chas nod. The old man requested a quill and parchment from one of the younger men in the crowd of onlookers. Chaz made a rudimentary map. Gabriella could already recognize the shape of the Foyle Island on it. He says there are ruins in a bay a few hours northward, Adamantis said, translating further. For the Elawn, it should take a short time to reach. Gabriella felt feathers flutter in her stomach. A woman with thick black braids and jingling anklets, and smelling delightfully of sandalwood, handed her a cup of tea. The liquid was red and tart. Gabriella's mouth puckered at first, but she immediately became aware that she wanted more. She took another sip and smiled. The Vaisani laughed and cheered. She turned to Dameon. Dameon, please go get our tea roots. We will trade them some of our tea for theirs. Invite Mr. Creetley to join us if he is interested. Dameon rushed off. Chaz's map had given her an idea. She reached into her shirt and removed the map from Nicomedes' workshop. She spread it out on the table and asked Chaz if he could decipher any meaning in it. Chaz studied it intently. Then, after a long while, shook his head. Undeterred, he called other men and women over to examine it. Gabriella noticed the deference they all showed Chaz and wondered if he was the town's chief. Chaz explained to Gabriella the professions of the people as they looked at the map. Teachers, scribes, priests, and priestesses. One of them would know what it meant, he assured her. But no one did. Next, he called upon the poets and the artists. When the poets and artists said they had never seen the symbols before, Chaz called upon the potters and weavers. When they gave up, he called the bakers, the coopers, and then the smithies. No one had any idea. But the crowd around them was soon noisy as the Vasani discussed and argued about the marks. While they debated, Gabriella asked Chaz about the pink bow on his beard. My granddaughter, the old man said, smiling. He called over the woman who had served Gabriella tea and introduced her as his daughter, Jambi. Gabriella stood up and curtsied. Jambi, in turn, beckoned to a young girl of around 4 years old. Chaz introduced her as Naima. Naima had sandy hair twisted into long braids that swung when she walked. Indigo and yellow flowers bobbed in her hair. Her eyes were granite gray like her grandfather's. Dameon returned with the bitter root tea, which Gabriella presented to Naima and asked her to give to her mother. Gabriella explained as best she could with signs and gestures that it was a bitter tea. She added that she and her mother liked it strong, but that her father and most others enjoyed it with cream and honey. Mortimer left the ship and joined them, but he refused to sit down, declining the offer of tea. He had relented and allowed women to carry the loads onto the Elawn. They could control their children better than he, but he frequently glared at them. Gabriella was embarrassed for his rudeness, but she tried to be understanding. After all, he was an outcast on Harkness. Few in the town ever showed him much kindness. Now that she knew the story of how he had lost his family, she wondered if that was why. Hard to show kindness when you have been shown little yourself. Gabriella was about to fold up the map and put it away when she noticed 3 men enter the square. They were dark from working under the sun, and their trousers were cut off at the calves. Their bodies were thin but sinewy, as if they were used to hauling heavy loads and had to remain agile to do so. She knew fishermen when she saw them. Everyone else has had a look at the map, she said. We should let them. Chaz beckoned to them and showed them the parchment map. They passed it between one another and nodded. They had seen these symbols many times. Gabriella almost jumped out of her seat. Where? What do they mean? Adamantis translated her question, and one of the men answered. He has seen these symbols on the ruins of the walled city, the ruined city to the north. Adamantis spoke to them a little longer, turning back to Gabriella. They describe ruins that mostly match what Dis would look like, but I remember from lore that Dis did not have a wall. They describe this place as the walled city. This is the only inconsistency. They are certain that this is the same city Chaz has given us directions to. Perhaps it is not Dis, but Dis can't be far. Do any of them know what the symbols mean? She asked. Adamantis shook his head. No, only that they have seen them there on the wall that the water touches, they say. They also call this place the flooded city. Could Dis be underwater? Perhaps. The earth and sea change with time. Does this mean our treasure is underwater? Mortimer asked, coming forward, his knees knocking the tea table so that the cups rattled. Adamantis rolled his shoulders. We shall have to see. Mortimer kicked the dirt at his foot and grumbled. In the center of the town square was a narrow pillar of stones a little over 12 feet high. At its base was a ring of white stones surrounded by a white fence. On top of the column was a round disc, and in the center of the disc was an object that glittered so brightly in the sun's light that Gabriella could not make out its shape. Mortimer studied the structure with an appraising eye. "What's its significance?" Mortimer asked. Adamantis translated the question for Chas, who became solemn as he answered. "Chas says that the spirits of their ancestors passed through that column on their journey to the afterlife," Adamantis reported. "Indeed," Mortimer said, his voice full of sarcasm. Gabriella felt a thrill of recognition. She moved to the edge of her seat, ready to explain that on her home island, they also had such a tower. She wanted to ask if the Vaisani also had dances where the spirits of the dead spoke through the living, but Mortimer was not finished. He interrupted. "What is that object on top of the column?" Chas eagerly explained, Adamantis breathlessly translating for him. "It is the skull of a small dragon. It is encrusted with jewels so that it can be seen from miles off. Inside lives the spirit that protects the village. The sight of the relic keeps dragons away." Gabriella looked up at the sky. Indeed, the mother wyvern was lost from sight. She asked Adamantis if he had explained to Chas how they had passed through the Narrows themselves, but before she could ask, she was distracted by a young man that had been pushed through the crowd to their table. He was older than Gabriella, but his clothes were tattered and unkempt, as if he were unable to tend to himself. His head was angled to the side as if his muscles were locked. His arms, too, were stuck in a position that thrust his hands out before his body. His eyes were not even with one another, and when they fell on Adamantis, he made an excited but inarticulate scream. Most of the Vaisani regarded him with benign expressions. One nearly patted his shoulder as if to calm him. Adamantis translated as Chas spoke. "You see, we have our own Sephahan as well. We try to tend to them as you do to yours." Chas was gesturing towards Dameon, who was rocking and mumbling softly to himself. "Sephahan is their word for cursed?" Gabriella asked. "It does not seem to have the same connotation," the elk said, "but I am not sure how to translate it into your tongue, except to say it suggests an obligation to give attention and care." Gabriella looked at the young man, older than she, and yet he would always be like a child. In some ways, it made her feel more generous towards her brother, who she described to Chas as also Sephahan, but in a different way. Chas gestured towards Mortimer, who had finally taken his seat but was tapping his knees impatiently, and asked through Adamantis, "And him too?" Some of the gathered people laughed, but Gabriella did not think Chas meant any harm. Mortimer, with his raged appearance, matted hair, tattered clothes, and weathered skin, did share some features of a madman. He certainly had not helped by refusing any tea. "No, no," Gabriella said quickly, but Mortimer had already stood up, his chair tumbling over. He tripped over it as he tried to turn. Some more Vasani laughed, but quieted when he leveled a kick at it. "Mr. Creedley, he meant no offense," Gabriella called after him. He ignored her and walked back toward the center of the square. Gabriella began to apologize for him and explain Mortimer's behavior. She wanted to share the story of his loss, to show them the Mortimer Creeley she had learned about, who had tried to break through the hull of a capsized ship to free his family, who had saved Dameon from drowning, who had faced a dragon without armor, shield, or spells, who had shared water with her when there was not enough for the four of them. The crowd about them had grown noisy, though, and it was hard for Chas to hear Adamantis speak. Finally, raising and lowering his hands, Chas quieted the conversations around them, and Gabriella was able to speak again. But the opportunity vanished when a woman's scream pierced the air. Children were running out of the square, pale with fright, while women and men were lifting their skirts to run into it, their faces set with concern. Mortimer shouted over the din. Gabriella leapt up and pushed through the crowd. Mortimer was dragging a child, a girl, by the collar of her shirt. His unsheathed sword was at her throat. It was Naima. "Mr. Creedley!" she screamed. She and Adamantis both started forward. Mortimer turned to Adamantis and raised the length of his sword. "Tell the people to get away from me or I kill the girl." "Mr. Creedley, what are you doing?" Gabriella cried. Shut up, you righteous little brat. I am tired of listening to you. I'm tired of people looking down on me. I did not come here to be made fool of. And I will not return to Harkness a poor man. Listen to me, Elk. Tell everyone to back off. Translate." Adamantis did, but his translation took a long while. Any desire to defend Mortimer had left Gabriella. She hoped that he was explaining that Mortimer was indeed mad. Chaz's face was completely white. His hands were clenched. He stepped forward to plead, but Mortimer cut him off. "Tell him, if he does not shut his mouth, I will chop off the little one's hand." Adamantis rapidly translated. Gabriella could hear the controlled anger in the elk's voice. Mortimer called to Dameon and told him to get on the Elawn. Gabriella grabbed him and told him not to. Mortimer put his blade to Naima's wrist and pressed it. Naima shrieked as a rivulet of blood ran across the blade and dripped down its tip. Gabriella let go of Dameon and urged him onto the ship. Then she walked towards Mortimer, her anger overcoming her fear. "Mr. Creedley, why are you doing this?" "You heard them. The entire city might be underwater. I don't know the last time you checked, but none of us has any gills." He backed up towards the stone column. "Now, I've been laughed at for far too long. I've been on the outside too long. I'm returning to Harkness with riches, and this might be the only treasure we find." He passed the ring of white stones around the base of the column. "Mr. Creedley, you can't take it," she said. "Gabriella," he said, his voice softening a fraction. "You need to learn that our cooperation is based on give and take. You've been taking. Now it's time to give." Chaz was speaking quickly. Adamantis translated. "Mortimer, Chaz says that if anyone touches the skull and removes it from the island, not only will the person who touches it die, but so will all the people of the island." Gabriella turned to Adamantis. "Is it true?" "I do not know. Magical relics can be very powerful. However, half of the relics in this world are not magic at all. What is important is that Chaz believes it, as do all these people." Gabriella ran forward to the ring of stones. "Mr. Creedley, if you take the skull, all these people will die." "Wives' tales. Don't tell me you believe all that." "Mr. Creedley, you might die." He locked his gaze with hers for a moment, then smiled and laughed. The crowd watched Mortimer climb the pillar in stunned, terrified silence. A few people covered their heads. Mortimer's arms and legs flexed and rippled with effort as he climbed. He grabbed the horn of the relic and leapt down to the ground. He held the glittering skull in his hands. Thunder did not rend the sky. The earth did not open up. "It is nothing but a goat's head, but these jewels are real," Mortimer said, turning the skull in his hands. He dragged Naima to the Elawn. It was unnecessary, though. All the Vasani were collapsing on the ground. This was not the gentle, restrained prostrations from when they arrived. Women fell in full faints. Men knelt down and beat their chests, wailing. Chaz stretched himself out face down, tears running off his cheeks into the dust. Mortimer released Naima and climbed the gangway to the Elawn, now pulling Dameon along behind him. "See how honest your new friends are. They lied to you. They look upset, but they surely are not dead. Me neither." He spoke in an affable tone, like two friends between which a disagreement has just passed. "You can still come with me, Gabriella. The elk, too. You just need to remember who is in charge now." She looked at Adamantis. She did not know how she could make herself get on the Elawn again, except that Dameon was there. "I could trade Mr. Creedley the map for Dameon," she said to Adamantis. "No, we board." "Why?" "It is our fault that this has befallen these people. Our only opportunity to set things right is bound to the Elawn." "But the relic is not real. It did not kill Mr. Creedley. We just need to convince them they don't need it. I don't think Mr. Creedley will give it up." "You won't convince them," Adamantis said. "This is their belief. They will lie here until they expire. It is in the heart of their way of life." Gabriella refused to believe the elk. She fell to Chaz's side and tried to rouse him, pulling at his arms. But he would not move. He wept, but he refused to budge. "Gabriella, come!" Adamantis said, his voice hard as steel. Gabriella climbed the gangway. She sat down at the bow of the ship, with her brother and Adamantis, like prisoners. Mortimer, living and breathing, set the sails, which caught a breeze as he took the wheel. Chapter 13. Dis. The Elawn banked northward. Gabriella regretted ever showing Mortimer how to fly the airship as he steered them out over the channel and then over the bay. The cold breeze made Gabriella shiver. It had been warmer on the ground. She stared at the glittering skull sitting on the middeck. So did Dameon. Indeed, It was a goat's head. Gabriella saw that they were in the role of buccaneers once again. She looked off the stern and wondered if it were not the skull but something else about the island that kept the dragons away. Despite the skull on the Elawn, the mother wyvern was following once more and had even closed some distance. The sun still shone. Mortimer remained alive. The oceans had not turned to fire. Mortimer set the wheel in place, then inspected the fresh vegetables, bread, tea, oats, and other provisions the Vasani had given them. He pulled out a loaf of bread and tore it in half, stuffing his mouth. "We have more than enough to reach home," he said, settling down on a crate of water jugs. "If the curse does not kill us," Gabriella said. "You disappoint me, Gabriella. You've shown a lot of bravery and smarts these last weeks. I would not have expected you to be a believer in superstitious nonsense about curses and the dead. The dead are the ones who sent me on this journey. They spoke to me. I am here because of them." At first, Mortimer laughed. Then he shook his head in what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "You know what lies inside the Tower of the Dead, Gabriella Carlyle? Nothing. It is empty. Not because spirits take up no space, but because they do not exist. The dead are dead. The worms eat their bodies in the earth, and the crabs at sea. Their voices are only in our heads." "You don't know what you are talking about. How else would the dancers know the things they do when they are mounted by a spirit?" Mortimer laughed again. "There are no secrets in Harkness. Women gossip in the afternoons, and then spirits seem wise at night." "But what about the predictions, the prophecies?" "Like, the rains will come after a mare gives birth to a filly? Gabriella, when have the rains not come? When have colts not been born? Of course such prophecies will always come true." He knelt down beside her, broke off a piece of bread, still warm from the ovens of Hassan, and handed it to her. She didn't want it, or anything from Mortimer, and handed it to her brother. "I'd offer you a peace, Elk, but you are looking daggers at me." Adamantus huffed and looked away. "The dead told us through me that if a Harkonite went in search of Nickermedes' treasure and returned with it, the Sev War would never trouble Harkness again," Gabriella said. Mortimer shrugged, unmoved by the specificity of the prophecy. "You heard what you wanted to hear, said what you wanted to say, Gabriella. I think a lot of those with belief do. They see what they want to see, as long as it bolsters what they already believe, as long as it confirms their own sense of self-importance. But you believed you were supposed to be here when the Tantalon brought you. You had faith in Gede and Brigitte." "I believe what I see, and I saw floating ships, even one flying itself. That's something. That's proof, not faith." "How can you be so sure about the dead?" "Because I asked them, Gabriella. Because I asked the dead, and they said nothing back. After my family died, I went to the tower. I wanted to be with my parents. I knelt beside it, calling to them, praying to them, and when I did not hear from them, I could not bear the thoughts of living without them, so I decided to join them. I opened the door and stepped inside. I stepped inside the most hallowed space in all of Harkness, the core of the tower, the eye of the gods, the heart of the dead, the forbidden place. And nothing. Nothing. I should have died. I was one of the uninitiated. The gods, the dead, whoever, should have struck me down, but I was still there. Then I realized it was all lies. Just like those people below. Everything they believe is a lie." He took another bite of bread, crumbs gathering in his beard. "The faithful," he scoffed. "They pray, then convince themselves what they wanted came true, that the dead or the gods are looking out for them. They see patterns where there are none, intent where there is randomness, meaning where there is nothing. Let me tell you, Gabriella, there is no one watching. No one cares about you but you. Like I said before, money and force are only gods worth serving, and right now they are on my side." Gabriella felt as if something fundamental to her life had just been thrown into doubt. Her heart physically pained her. A series of memories, summonings at night, trips she took with her mother to leave flowers against the wall of the tower for their ancestors, gazing down at the tower from the hills above with a mixture of fear, awe, and pride. Now, all those feelings of attachment, her entire sense of certainty regarding the tower, her entire purpose for this trip, were crumbling. She did not know what to believe. Mortimer was not without compassion. He touched her shoulder and spoke in a tone of a friend teaching another a hard lesson. "You should be grateful I am sharing the wisdom with you now," he said. "You should be grateful for your brother, too. Burden that he is, at least you have family." He took another piece of bread and handed the rest to her. He had plucked some of the flowers out of Naima's hair. He took them now and stuck them through the buttonhole in his jacket, making a little half smile as he returned to the wheel. Gabriella could not bring herself to look at her brother or Adamantus, although she felt the elk close beside her. She wanted Adamantus to say something, to tell her everything Mortimer had said was wrong. But he said nothing. "What if he is right?" Gabriella finally asked. "What is left for us to believe?" The elk was silent a long time. Every second that he did not refute Mortimer's words was another moment that the trapper's statements gained power and weight. Finally, Adamantus answered. "I believe in you, Gabriella. So does your brother." "I want a serious answer." "I gave you one." "But that's just the problem," she said, angry now. "You believe in something you should not. You are making me into something I'm not. I'm a fool, a girl. The dead are dead, gone. We don't turn into gods, we make them up. I was a feverish idiot." "Nicomedes did not believe in gods either," the elk said. Gabriella turned to the elk in surprise. It was incomprehensible that the man whom she had begun to venerate, whom she felt such admiration for, would not be a believer. "It's true. Nicomedes once said that the seeds of the gods lie within us. Nicomedes believed that if we treated others with the love and devotion we usually reserve for the gods, that the world would be a much better place." Gabriella's mind reeled. How could she find fault with a man who had done so much in the service of others, who had indeed been better to his fellow neighbors than many who believed fervently in gods had been? Gade's words about mystery came back to her. What had he called the gods? A riddle. And life a mystery. Perhaps there was no such answers in this life. Was that what Gade meant? But if all belief was indeed all superstition, she hoped that the Vasani might live. "Will the Vasani die?" she asked. When the elk did not answer her, she repeated her question. "It is their belief," the elk said, looking at the skull which seemed silly and inert on the deck. "Some would rather die than give up their beliefs." Gabriella knew she would take life and mystery over death and certainty. She also felt ridiculous, simple, and childish. "I just don't feel worthy of this anymore. Am I a fool for believing in the dead? In the gods?" She held her head in her hands. "What do we do now?" "I believe," the elk said, stressing his words, "that we must survive. It is our first priority. All questions will be answered when needed. Now, let's study the map of the labyrinth." Gabriella did not feel like eating, but her growling stomach reminded her that she needed to. Guilt weighed heavily upon her as she finished the loaf of bread packed by the Vasani. She did not eat much, and although she tried spreading some green jelly on the bread for her brother, he did not seem to like its novel taste. "I should have known better," she thought as Dameon spat it out on the deck and said it tasted like grass. Gabriella provided him with a plain piece of bread and cursed him under her breath for being difficult. Chicken eggs on Vassan did not seem too different than those from Harkness. Gabriella and Dameon helped themselves to some that had been hard-boiled. She noted numerous packages of tea, but Gabriella could not bring herself to open them. As she dropped the eggshells over the railing, Gabriella studied the coast. The sun was past its zenith. A haze hung over the hills inland, but the shore swept by the sea breeze remained clear. She searched the coast for recognizable features from Chaz's map, but found none. A single island to the north was shaped like a farmer's wide-brimmed hat. Gabriella remembered that according to Chaz's map, 2 islands waited just south of the inlet to the Bay of Dis. There had not been a lone island on the map. She wondered if they had already gone too far, or if Chaz's memory was failing him. Mortimer had the hand-drawn map in his hands. He looked back and forth from the coast to the paper. "Perhaps it is the only island after all," he said, looking to Gabriella for some type of reassurance. She gave him none, angered as she was. "No use in sulking over the ways of the world, girl," Mortimer grumbled, turning back to the wheel and drooping their altitude. He spun the wheel, slapping the handles with his bony hands. The Elawn banked towards the island. Mortimer brought them low enough over the water that Gabriella could smell the sea and heard waves breaking on the beach. The island loomed closer. Adamanta suggested that they swing their direction westward into the open sea to change their angle of approach. Perhaps what appears to be one island is two when seen from the west. Mortimer turned the Elawn again. The island slid slowly across the starboard bow. It had two distinct hills. As the ship moved alongside, it was clear that while the hills sloped towards one another, they actually did not touch and were separated by a narrow channel. The two islands shown on the map. Mortimer cranked the wheel to turn the Elawn towards the bay. "Then we are here," he said, his breath catching. As the ship banked, Gabriella looked behind them to see the mother wyvern swinging her wings sideways to alter her course as well. Since leaving Vaison, the mother had flown nearer to the Elawn. Yet she still did not chase as closely as she had on the open sea. The wyvern's distance prompted Gabriella to consider the stolen goat's skull glinting on the middeck. Could it have power? She wondered. She did not know what to believe in anymore. Mortimer was supposed to be dead, but he wasn't. The Vasani thought they would die, so they were dying. If the gods and dead were figments of their imagination, how had she known the name of Nicomedes? She did not recall hearing it ever before. But perhaps she had, and perhaps she had made the entire prophecy up. Perhaps it was as silly as her hope of Dameon being cured. Cured or not, she knew she needed to get him home. It was her fault he was in danger. She turned her attention to the bay. She wished she had not eaten. Arriving here in this place was supposed to have been a triumph, an achievement. Now, everything had gone wrong. Her stomach felt sick. Her head began to ache once more, as it had when she had not drunk for days. When she rubbed her temples, she realized her palms were clammy and wet. She joined Dameon and Adamantus at the bow. Below, there was little that distinguished the coastline of the bay. The land was wild. No villages, no planted fields waited below. Only sheer cliffs with tenacious red heather growing and clumps of brightly colored trees, their branches already half stripped by the sea's winds. Everyone was silent. But if it was with expectation or disappointment, Gabriella was not sure. Perhaps a bit of both. In the northernmost corner of the bay, tall cliffs leaned over the choppy dark waters. Birds circled above the gray rock faces. The cliffs dropped directly down into the water. There was no place where a city might fit. But the land had more to reveal. As they neared the cliffs, it was clear that one cliff wall was much closer than the other. The bay continued to open up around the corner of the promontory. Time seemed to drag as they moved past the first cliff. Beyond the headland, the bay was sheltered from the sea and placid as a lake. It was the perfect natural harbor. In the northwest, the unwelcoming walls of the mountains gave way to gentle slopes, with red fields of heather broken by the occasional apron of rocks that had avalanched down from above. A waterfall threaded through a deep cut in the slope. Much closer, where the water met the shore, Gabriella could see trees. Trees growing over stones piled in rows of what used to be structures. It has to be, she whispered. Gabriella studied the cliffs above the city. The buildings were in a much more advanced state of collapse than she imagined. But where was the tower on the cliff that was once Nicomedes' workshop? Was it destroyed too? Not seeing the remains of a tower, Gabriella searched for something more humble. Perhaps a foundation or pathway, she reasoned. Most of the stone on the promontory was natural and raw, except for a splotch of white, as if mortar had bled down the cliff face. Gabriella studied the stain carefully. Above it was a shape that was too regular, too rectangular to be natural. Could that be it? She asked Adamantus. We will have to move closer to find out, the elk said. Is that the wall the fisherman spoke of? Mortimer asked. The Elawn was just passing over a wall that ran from one cliff to the other. On one side of it rested the waters of the bay. On the other side was a mixture of mud and marsh reeds. This was once the harbor wall, not the city wall, Adamantus said. The city itself was never walled, but the harbor was. In the centuries that have passed, the harbor was silted up. The swamp you see before you was once the harbor of Dis. The ground close by the city was flat and grass-covered, but nearer to the wall, it became a mixture of stagnant water and reeds and mud flats. The tracks of small animals, probably fox, beavers, and otters, crisscrossed between the cattails, water glistening in the bottom of the prints. Mortimer brought the Elawn along the wall so Gabriella could look for the map symbols the fisherman had mentioned. They were not hard to find. Only the symbols beneath the water were illegible, covered by swaying moss and algae. Where the carvings were above water, they were etched so deeply that they were easy to read, though their meanings were still unclear. The Elawn floated into the city, above the ruined buildings. In ancient times, a small river had run between the stone buildings and along streets through a series of channels. Gabriella wondered if this was the same stream flowing from the bottom of the waterfall on the mountainside. Now, no longer tamed, the river had flooded its canals and flowed freely down the streets of Dis and through the doorways of abandoned houses. At one time, the river would have rushed into the bay through the mouths of great stone spouts carved to resemble faces. These were not human faces, but rather something crossed between humans, fish, and gargoyles. Now the mouths were choked and blocked with debris, and the river had escaped from its boundaries. It swept over the quays and poured over the faces, drawing long strands of canal grass and algae over the sad eyes and cheeks. Below the spouts, a deep pool emptied itself through a meandering stream that cut through the silted harbor in countless bends and twists. The city rose upwards with the land, so the Elawn did as well. They passed over avenues and boulevards now filled with centuries' worth of rubble. The forest had taken over the city. Like sand dunes that cover desert ruins, drifts of leaves were piled deep along walls, burying doorways and window ledges. Trees were now the permanent masters of Dis. They had taken root in chambers, on walkways, even atop crumbling walls. A city square, once open to the sky, was now hidden beneath a canopy of dense, colorful leaves. One tree, however, had lost its leaves completely already. Its bareness allowed Gabriella, for an instant, to glance into the depths below. She saw a doorway and a window, the edges softened by moss. Tumbled stones and pieces of statue lay among tree roots. There was an arm, a foot, a flowing robe. Then the Elawn slipped forward, and the statue was gone. The ground rose, and a rocky hill lay straight ahead of them. "We'll find the ruins of the palace there," Adamanta said. Gabriella could see that it would have been the perfect place for a citadel, with its commanding view of the harbor and the city. The palace was even more impenetrable now, since the only road leading up to it had been obliterated by a landslide. This collapse appeared to have been more recent than some of the other decay, for small trees grew out of the detritus that had flowed down the slope. On the crest of the hill, some of the thick palace walls still stood. Trees had invaded the palace as well, and vines scaled the walls like leafy ladders. Weeds grew thickly in pots that had once held houseplants, their roots bursting out of the cracked bottoms. A silence had settled over the walls that Gabriella imagined was similar to the silence that came to mourners visiting a graveyard, or sailors passing a shipwreck. She was swept by a looming sense of mortality, the passage of time, and the proximity of loss. She was awestruck by the power and patience of nature, which had undone so many of these things that human hands had created. Then, as they turned back toward the city, an aqueduct appeared out of the ruins at the back of the hill. It stood alone, some of its sections crumbled away, but its arch still soared over the trees that had grown beneath it for centuries. Gabriella felt a flood of pride for Nicomedes. This structure of his had remained. He was long gone, and so were all of those who had once dwelt in his city. But his ideas had endured. Not all is lost to time, she thought. "Where will we find Nicomedes' workshop in all this wilderness?" Mortimer asked. Did the aqueduct remind him of the inventor as well? Gabriella wondered. "His workshop was above the city," Adamanta said. "I think I may have already found it, Mr. Creedley," Gabriella said and pointed to the white stain on the mountain above Dis. Mortimer praised her sharp eye, but his compliments failed to move her. The trapper, whom Gabriella had begun to think of increasingly as their captor, leaned on the levers and the Elawn drifted upwards. Gabriella was surprised at just how high the tower remains were, as she swayed at the return of her vertigo. It was like those first few days on the Elawn when she had yet to adjust to the height. For many weeks, the vertigo had not troubled her. With so much else on her mind, she had not had the time to be bothered with it. The necessity of survival had been sort of a cure. But now, with her stomach already in knots over the Vasani, she watched the ground recede with increasing sickness. What she had initially thought was a crumbling wall, when she looked up, was actually an intact building with windows and doorways still visible. The building's doorway faced the mountain, but it opened up many feet above where anyone could have placed a foot. A few piles of mortared stone remained, spaced equidistantly along the mountain outcropping, leading towards the body of the mountain itself. It was Adamantis who recognized what they were seeing. "This was the loading dock," he said. "We must remember that in the day of Dis, airships were used regularly. They would have moored here. The building you see here would have been a guardhouse and a shelter from the elements while goods were loaded and unloaded. A wooden walkway would have led to the workshop within the mountain there. The footings for the wooden bridge are still visible. Like his hidden workshop at the waterfall, Nicomedes preferred living stone for his structures. It was more secure. We should turn our attention to the mountain itself." The naked stone of the mountain was dark gray. Far below, its base spread out in gentle slopes like the edges of a skirt. Grass grew plentiful there, and Gabriella imagined it was an ideal place for grazing sheep. Higher up, the mountain was less forgiving. The walls were sheer, so much so that not even birds appeared to be able to build nests there. The top was crowned in natural piles of rock, like spokes on a menacing headpiece. The only forgiving terrain was a sharp grassy slope that ran down from the backside of the peak. But even this patch of vegetation was perilous, for it was steep and ended abruptly. A misstep anywhere on its face would turn into an uncontrollable tumble that led to a drop that ended on a shelf of jagged boulders hundreds of feet below. "Look," said Gabriella, pointing as they flew toward the dock. Where the spur of rock met the body of the mountain were two iron doors as tall as 5 men. The footings of the walkway led directly to the doors, rusted to a dull reddish brown, the stone beneath them stained from the metal's runoff. Ruins, written in relief, covered the top half of the panels. Adamantis translated. "Here, the only currency is knowledge, the prime principle equality." He was silent for a moment. "There is no doubt. This is Nicomedes' tower." Mortimer pulled the Elawn up beside the heavy doors, immobile as stone, gaping open just wide enough for them to enter. Cold air drifted out from between the iron slabs like the mountain's breath. Gabriella could see that the tower was not completely dark within the sunlight slanting down from windows lining the ceiling. "We'll be able to see inside," Gabriella said, her voice echoing from the inner chamber beyond the doors. A ledge ran along the spur, from the doors and to the base of the grassy verge. The ledge would make a footpath, but a narrow one. Gabriella had no desire to walk it, but she realized that the only place to moor the ship was a tree at the bottom of the verge. Mortimer let the Elawn drift up beside it, leap overboard, then secured the line. Gabriella wondered what she should bring. The map, of course. A bag for treasure? She emptied a satchel of maize ears and slung it over her brother's shoulder. She emptied another and placed the wyvern egg in it before securing the bag across her chest. Mortimer followed her example, taking an empty bag and filling another with supplies, extra rope, resin torches, and a lantern. Finally, he added the ember box to light the torches. They dropped the gangway onto the grass. Gabriella told her brother to be careful, then took his collar in her fist. Mortimer went first along the edge, his body pressed up against the mountainside. Gabriella followed the trapper, telling Dameon not to look down. She tried hard not to as well. The spectacular view out over the city and miles out into the sea was more than enough to remind her just how high they stood. She felt particularly vulnerable on the cliff. But the mother wyvern did not attack them. Perhaps she had seen Gabriella place the egg in the bag she carried. The dragon circled the tower a few times before perching on the rocks of the promontory across the valley. With a claw, she cleaned her teeth. Gabriella's hair was stuck to her forehead with sweat by the time she reached the doors. Since the wooden footbridge had rotted away, the floor within the doors was high, level with Mortimer's shoulders. He lifted Dameon and Gabriella up first. They lowered a rope for him to follow. Adamantis easily made the jump in a single bound. As the elk entered, Gabriella noticed the wyvern take wing and cross the gorge. While the others went further inside, the mother landed on the ruins of the building at the edge of the spur. She was keeping as close as possible to her egg. Gabriella shivered and pulled the bag with the precious cargo closer. One by one, they entered the mountain tower. Chapter 14. The Mountain Tower. Darkness swallowed them. As her eyes adjusted, Gabriella could make out a large chamber with a high-vaulted ceiling. Doorways lined the far wall. The sound of their feet echoed off bare stone. Dameon stood so close to Gabriella that his body pressed against her and made it hard for her to walk. Adamantus went ahead of them, the clopping of his hooves creating the impression that the chamber was filled with cantering horses. Dim light streamed down from skylights and cut shimmering columns into the darkness. Mortimer took a deep breath, and his exhale was a ghostly hiss that even made him recoil. "You say this place has been empty for centuries," he asked Adamantus, "because I don't feel like we are alone." Adamantus had stopped a few feet ahead of them. Even in the dim light, Gabriella could see his body tense. He extended his nose to search the air for a scent. "That is because we are not." Gabriella moved towards Dameon, but it was too late. The bolt of lightning came so suddenly it overwhelmed her, a searing hammer that flung her through the air. She knew she was flying at the wall. She knew she must have hit it, but the pain she felt throughout her body overpowered the sense of impact, even time. She could have been sprawled on the floor for minutes, hours, or days. She would have guessed weeks if she had not opened her eyes and seen her brother's face as he shook her. "Gabriella, wake up!" Adamantus stood in front of them. Mortimer was shouting, but Gabriella could not make sense of his words. His sword, still nicked from a wyvern's horns, was drawn. Dameon's touch hurt her, yet she was still too weak to say so. She moved to stop him. He reached up to catch something falling from her grasp as her arms weakened. The egg, she remembered. It was still in her arms. She had lifted her arms to protect it. Then a second blast struck her. This one was not as powerful as the last. Dameon instead caught the brunt of it. It had come from a different angle than the first, from another corner of the room. Enough of it still hit Gabriella that the pain returned. Her skin felt as if it had brushed the surface of the sun. Her body writhed. She could not control her arms. They shot out to her side. She was blasted up against the wall again while the egg tumbled away. She retained enough of her senses to hear the egg fall. It made a noise, almost like a tree branch breaking in the wind. A lightning-shaped crack split it from end to end. It wobbled as it rolled, rolling back and forth until it disappeared down a fissure in the floor. There was a silence, followed by a louder crack as the egg struck the bottom of the chasm it had fallen into, followed by thunder. Mortimer fell down to his knees at the noise. Adamantus buckled. Dameon, still stunned himself, his clothes smoking from the heat of the last blast, was unable to move his hands to protect his ears. His face registered the full pain of the mother wyvern's roar. The mother had heard the crack of her egg, and her voice was terrible, all the worse from the effect of the echoes in the hall. The roaring mother violently threw herself against the doors. With the weight of the dragon behind it, the giant iron door budged and groaned like an off-key horn. Gabriella strained to right herself. Dust fell from the ceiling. Mortimer was paralyzed between the danger behind them and before them. Gabriella twisted onto her elbow and looked between Adamantus's legs. Sybil leaned against a column, one she must have been hiding behind before she had attacked. She was still in her soiled, ill-fitting dress. In her doorway across the room was Sybil's other self, pointing her smoking wand in Gabriella's direction with her left hand. It was too unreal. But as Gabriella's hearing returned, she could hear the wild laughter of both girls. "Thought you could escape from me, did you? Thought you could leave me there, did you? But you never realized you left me stronger than you found me. Now you will see what happens to slaves that betray us. That wyvern will make quick work of us all if we don't do something." Mortimer hollered as the mother smashed against the doors again. "Silence!" Sybil shouted. She nodded to her twin. "Libby's, see to it." Libby's, as Sybil called her, ran to the doors. The wyvern struck them again, causing one door to open wider. The whole of the dragon's face appeared in the opening. Gabriella moved to cover her brother from the inevitable fireball. Libby stood in front of the door, undeterred. She raised her wand, and a blast of lightning shot forth. The wyvern fell away with a screech. The door stood empty and smoking in her wake. The wyvern had tried to kill Gabriella and the others more than once, but the mother had also saved and protected them. Somehow, Gabriella had come to think of the wyvern as their ally. Now her vision blurred with tears as she watched the beast tumble onto the rock outcropping like a bird that has struck a window. Her cracked, broken claws gouged the stone as she tried to regain her footing. Libby showed no fear of the mother dragon. She was too confident in her powers. The mirror image of Sybil moved behind the door that had swung open. Another blast of light, this one more sustained and bluish in color, pulled the door shut. With a final flourish, a yellow stream snaked its way from the end of the wand to an iron lever, which groaned downward and fell into place behind the doors locking them. As the mother recovered, the pounding on the doors resumed, but it was weaker now, and the iron did not budge. The only light came from the skylights above. "Now that is taken care of, we may return to business," Sybil said. Mortimer interrupted her. "Who are you?" "This is Sybil, the princess from Foyle Island. She cursed the island and destroyed the castle. She killed Gayday," Gabriella gasped, fighting for breath. "Oh, are you still sad about your blue friend?" Sybil mocked. Gabriella crawled to her brother's side and wrapped her arms around him. He was rocking and keening softly. There were deep gouges in his arm where he had cut himself with his own fingernails. "Who is that funny-looking boy?" Sybil asked. "Indeed," her twin added. "Why does he shake like that? Did we perhaps poach his brains?" "Well, I've always liked poached eggs," Sybil said. While the girls laughed, Adamantus lunged forward, his antlers lowered. Libby's was the closer of the two, and although he could not reach both of them, his intent to kill at least one was clear. Sybil cried out to warn her twin, but Libby's was doubled over by her own laughter. Libby's turned, with only enough time to widen her eyes, but the yell crumbled with a loud bellow as Mortimer leapt upon him and dug the dagger into his shoulder. Both Elk and Trapper collapsed in a heap while Libby's rushed to her sister's side. Mortimer was quick to recover, his legs set in a wide stance, his fists raised in a fighting pose, his dagger dripped bright red blood. "Mr. Creedley!" Gabriella screamed. Adamantus staggered up, the blood draining from his wound while Mortimer edged closer to the princesses. "So, this is how you cast your lot," the Elk said. "You would kill a child. She is a monster, twisted by the Sevwar. What would Omanuju say of you, Elk? Don't you dare speak of him. He showed you kindness when no one else did. And now he is dead. See where kindness got him? You and the girl are naive. Power always wins." He nodded at the twins. "They have it." "You traitor!" Gabriella cried. Sybil had recovered from her shock and raised the wand toward Adamantus. "Wait, princess. He still has value. He is wise and knows much about the treasure we seek." "Treasure?" Sybil and Libby said in unison. "Yes, a greater treasure than you can imagine. One that will make up for the losses of your palace." "Mortimer Creedley, if you think I will cooperate," the Elk began. "You will, because you and the girl need the treasure. Like I said on Vison, you and the girl are free to join me. Just remember, I am in charge." "You are a traitor," Adamantus growled. "Wait, I am in charge," Libby shouted. "No, I am," Sybil said, shoving her twin aside. "I was first." "I am second in command then," Libby said. "Fine," Sybil said. All the party stood staring, reassessing their alliances. Sybil finally broke the silence. "Were you not with them when they came to Foyle before?" she asked Mortimer. "Dameon and I came in a separate airship, one that piloted itself." "So you brought the ship. We found it in the garden, boarded it, and it brought us here," Libby said. Mortimer nodded. "The ships, they are enchanted. If it brought you here, then that means you are to join us." He made a shallow bow. "So, it is to you, Mr. Creedley, that we are indebted, for as our castle crumbled, we found that floating ship. It had been damaged by falling stones, but it was still worthy of flight. We leapt into it completely in desperation, completely ignorant of where it was taking us, and it took us into dangerous places, islands full of smoke and dragons, which were terribly dangerous." Libby piped. This time, Sybil did not laugh and rather rolled her eyes. "Indeed, how terrible it must have been for you," Mortimer said. "How did you make it through alive?" Sybil straightened. Libby copied her down to her expression. "Why, with these, a few blasts from our wands and the dragons were running scared." Mortimer's eyes fixed on the wands for a long while. "You must be skilled mages." "We are," they answered in unison, giggling. "Once on the ship, all we wanted was revenge upon Gabriella," said Libby. "The ship must have sensed our need and brought us to this place. When we saw you approach, we could not believe our good fortune. It seemed like forever while we waited for you to come through the door so we could attack," Sybil added. "And a well-executed attack it was." Mortimer made another bow. He stepped closer to where Gabriella and Dameon huddled. "I have a proposal for you. I will split the treasure with you, 2/3 for you, 1/3 for myself. We can help each other, using both the Elawn and the Tantalon to carry the gold back." "The Tantalon, as you call it, is finished," Libby said. "Shortly after it reached its destination, it split in two. The damage it had sustained on our home island, the wear and tear of the winds, not to mention the dragons we encountered, were too much for it." "No matter," said Mortimer. I am happy to see we have already helped each other and may continue to do so. I brought you the Tantalon. I brought you Gabriella. And with Gabriella, I bring you the map to the labyrinth protecting the treasure. I brought you her brother, too, someone else to torture. Finally, I have brought you our ship, so you may leave this place. Gabriella held her brother tighter. Her mind was a maze of confusion. Had even Gade's companion, Brigitte, betrayed them by bringing the sisters there? Was everything she had taken for purpose a pattern she had imposed? The sanction of the gods, the will of the dead, the aid of Gade and his kind. Nothing made sense anymore. The door shook and banged again, with a renewed attack from the wyvern. This time, the iron moaned and bent inward, as if a giant were smashing his fist against the outside. Dust fell from the ceiling to the floor with a hiss. Flames crackled against the iron as the wyvern breathed fire from the outside. The metal shrieked with loud popping noises as it expanded from the heat. "Well, let us not wait any longer," Sybil commanded. "Let's go treasure hunting." Chapter 15. Foyle Island. The princess was weeping on the battlements. Below, the lights of the city twinkled and the noises of the party, her party, drifted upwards. The city was in celebration of the heir to the throne. Bonfires burned throughout the streets. Music played from all corners, making a discordant noise as the melodies jumbled together here, high up, on the walls of Castle Foyle. It was Princess Sybil's curse that even at her own party, most of the city did not notice her, did not know her own unhappiness. Even those noble members of the court senior, accomplished, and connected enough to be invited to the royal celebration, paid her little notice, as they were caught up in the competition to gain favor of her parents. A fleeting word, a glance from the king or queen, would boost or crush an ego for these hangers-on and sycophants. So it was with little disruption that she had fled while the social climbers, the obsequious servants, the up-and-comers jockeyed for position. Sade had grown to know them all. He had learned to be observant in their intervening years, since he and his brother had come to Foyle Island. At first, they both labored as longshoremen, where the comings and goings of trade, many of the city's secrets were laid bare before them. In time, Sade had become a tutor to children of wealthy families, and from there an interpreter, for he quickly picked up the Oceanic tongue, and many of those on Foyle did not speak the common tongue. While his brother maintained their contacts at the city's feet, mingling among commoners, Sade soon learned the ways and personalities of the ruling class. Even the king knew him by name as an expert translator and useful advisor. So his power had grown, and it was natural that he would be invited to the celebration of Sybil Foyle's coming of age at the castle, with its grand foyers, its high windows looking out over the sea, and of course, its majestic tree with the silver bark and blue leaves, a living jewel, the heart of the island. What a tree it was! Most islanders saw it was a mighty symbol of their heritage, with thick, bountiful boughs and high crown that caught the first and last rays of the sun each day. But it took a sorcerer's eyes to see the raw power, the untapped enchantments woven into its fibers. Full of life and light they were, but Sade knew that could be changed. He was actually determined to make sure it was. In the pocket of his cloak, he had the key. He only needed to wait for the right time. As he watched Sybil bury her face in her hands, her sorrow such a contrast to the cheerful, sparkling dress she wore, he knew the time had come. For he had watched the girl. He knew her discontent. Her fear could bring this royal house down. "Why do you weep, your highness?" he said, approaching her where she crouched between two balustrades. "Don't call me highness. Leave me alone," she said, running away. She came to a corner of the castle and turned into the round top of a tower, where she fell to her knees beside a flagpole. It shook as the sea wind snapped the banner hoisted there displaying her house's seal, a blue tree with a crown of stars on a field-colored russet, like a sunset. It was a stubborn reminder of the responsibilities and obligations she could not hide from as a princess coming of age. There should have been guards about, but even they had slipped off for a sip or two of strawberry wine. It left the two of them alone. Sade followed her to the tower top. No torches burned there. The only light was that which shone from the bonfires below. Considering the play of light and shadow, one might imagine the city burning and the castle under siege. "Your Highness, it is not fitting for you to be so unhappy on your birthday. I said to leave me alone." "I have," Sade said, allowing some edge to creep into his voice. I could have called the entire court to my side. I am sure your parents would want you back in your place at their table. But I have not. It is only me, and I have respected your wish to be alone. Perhaps I understand you better than others. She looked up from behind her hands, her eyes glistening before she shut them again and sobbed. I don't want to grow up. Sade knelt beside her. I know, he said, for I see all. Her sobbing stopped, and she looked at him again, as if considering him for the first time. Do you know me, child? Yes. You are Maston Beckham, translator and advisor to the court. You also tutor the children of some of the lords and ladies. That I am. And so, I have watched and studied all that is around me. I know, like you, all the phony faces of nobles present, all the petty games they play, and all the heavy responsibilities that come to your parents as rulers of it all. I don't like it, and I don't want any of it, she spat. You want to stay a little girl. She sniffed and nodded. I miss when I was younger, and Mother and Father and I would go for picnics on the slopes and play down on the beach, catching crabs, digging for clams. I'd get dirty and Mother would not mind. But now, it is all about sitting like a lady, speaking like a lady, walking like a lady. I hate it. Sade rubbed the hem of her dress between his fingers. Sparkling stones sewn into its lace wrinkled in the light so that she glittered as she moved. It is a beautiful dress. It is the last time I shall wear it. It is my favorite, but Mother says I must replace it, that it is for a little girl, and that I will soon outgrow it. So much pressure to leave your childhood behind. It's a tragedy we force children to grow up so soon. I miss being a child. I don't want to stop being one. Then don't, Sade said, releasing the dress and reaching into a pocket of his cloak. He withdrew a wand made of pale wood. It radiated a faint blue light in the darkness. Do you know what this is? A wand? Yes, made from the wood of the silver tree. The great tree by the courtyard. Yes, it is powerful, Sybil, and I give it to you as a birthday present. But it is the last one you will ever need, for with it, you can accomplish wonders. But I don't have the gift of magic. You don't need it. It is an endowed object. It is a lost art. Mages once wove spells into steel swords, wooden staffs, or canvas sails, so that people without the gift could call on magic when they needed it. Why was it lost? This is old lore, which you do not need to be worried about. This wand, I made it especially for you, so that it only responds to your will, your wishes. He handed it to her, and she immediately pointed its tip at his chest. Sade felt a great hollow open up in the pit of his stomach. Had he made a grave miscalculation? A bead of sweat formed on his temple and rolled down his face. He strained to project the same steady calm and compassion towards Sybil, while ever so gently taking her by the wrist and pointing the wand away. You must be careful whom you point it at, he said, clearing his throat. Why? What will it do to you? You would experiment on the only friend that understands you. Years of living in the royal court had taught Sybil a few things. She was not naive. You want something. My father says everyone wants something from you when you are royal. The best lies have a kernel of truth. Sybil, you know me as Master Beckham, but I also go by a different name I will share with you now. It is Sade. I am a member of an order of sorcerers. Once, I was also a prince, but I had no desire to take on the role of king. I wanted nothing to do with all the boring ceremony, the pompous nobles, the phony parasites. So the man who would become my mentor presented me a wand like this that allowed me to stop time, to keep myself from aging. But you were grown up now. Sade smiled and whispered, I only appear so. But what if I told you I was 100 years old? He shared the lie the way a hunter would lay a trap. I would not believe you. Very well, you might not, but you will believe me when the same gift is bestowed on you. But first, you must stop time for all those around you. How? Will it through the wand. No need for anyone to be hurt. Just petrify them. The more you freeze, the more you lock into stone, the longer your life will be. The tear tracks were drying on her face. A trembling smile was forming at the corner of her mouth. She held the wand with 2 hands, her thumbs rubbing its wood, her knuckles locked. He knew by the look in her eye that she was his.